100 Days of Gratitude, day 79, and today I'm grateful for communication. I've been reflecting on that lately, this idea of not only our ability to communicate and all the different ways we do it, the modes of communication and how much that has progressed, evolved over a long period of time, but so much in such a short, recent period of time. So communication, right? It is actually something that all species communicate. And it's really fascinating to think about, the language of plants, the language of birds, the language of bacteria, the language of literally every species has its own language and communication. And humans, totally fascinating. The amount of diversity of our ability to communicate through language, right? The spoken word, the written word, all the different types of languages, and then you get it down into the nuances of dialects and how that's always constantly changing and evolving. Wade Davis, he wrote a really beautiful book called The Wayfinders, and a little bit of a kind of bittersweet sadness, this idea that there are people alive today who are literally the last to be able to speak their native tongue, last people in the world that know that language. So there are languages that are going extinct, every year. And there's kind of this homogenization of language to just kind of a few forms. English, obviously, being very notable. Spanish, another one. You even think of like huge countries like India and China that have just an incredible diversity of languages within them, and then the dialects all underneath that. And even within those countries, right, this kind of homogenization to Hindi as just one example. So anyways, there's a real beauty to human language, and obviously starting out as just kind of speech. And who knows what it was before then, and what the world looked like, and humans and our kind of journey and evolution. But they say 100,000 years ago was just primary forms of the spoken word, and it wasn't until, they say, apparently like 3200 BCE where we developed writing. And many different cultures around the world, like in Egypt and Iraq, and then a little bit later, like 1500, it was China, and how much that has progressed. And then what we wrote on too, right? The idea of papyrus, parchment, or sheep skins, that were prepared in a certain way. I watched this little mini documentary of this Italian man that is still preparing sheep skins in the old way that were used, to write on, and how like durable they are and how well they preserve. And yeah, the advent of writing and that ability to communicate that way and, send messages, before it just being verbal, and for the longest time too, to transmit a message long distance, it was done with runners, right? People like running, village to village or over across hillsides, mountainsides, relays of horses. You hear about in Africa how they would communicate, over long distances with drums, almost like a Morse code kind of a thing. Carrier pigeons, right? It's so fascinating to think about humans' modes of communications. And, for the longest time, relative to how much has happened in the past little while, arguably, one of the biggest transformations, catalysts was printing. And there was the early printing with, like blocks, like as the Chinese used to do. But in the 15th century, the idea of the printing press, and, the revolution that brought through, books, flyers, newspapers, so much of what we just take for granted in our everyday communication, and what has come as a result of that. Even the idea of the postal service, right? That goes back to, you know, the 1500s. And it's actually, I was just reading an article on it this morning, you know, just fascinating to see the evolution of that. You know, like there was an innovation where, you know, the sender paid the postage. It wasn't always that way, right? And even just postal boxes, and they had their own kind of evolution. Postal service. The pencil wasn't even invented until 1564. So the idea of, you know, what were people using before, right? Like quills to write. I'll post it actually. There's a really fascinating little short video called iPencil. I think it's called iPencil. Anyways, it's about kind of the creation of a pencil, and just, you know, how incredibly complex and genius that is. Like there's actually no single one person that can create a pencil, just because of all the materials and the technology and the innovations that are involved. And it kind of speaks to, yeah, the miracle of, you know, of an economy, and how we get things as everyday and basic as a pencil, which are really actually quite miraculous if you break it down. So beyond that, 1837, I wrote some of these dates down because I'm not, you know, totally good at remembering those kinds of things. Was the telegraph. And then that as an innovation in terms of helping us to communicate more long distance. Did you know that the fax machine was actually invented before and in use before the telephone? I guess that kind of makes sense, right? In terms of, yeah, more of a similar type of process and transcription, you know, like a telegraph, came the fax machine. Telephone, 1876, and then the typewriter. Also in that late 1800s, the innovation again of communication and what that brought. It was in the early 1900s, then radio communication, and then how that brought then radios and everything that brought with it into people's homes. And then very quickly, shortly after that, was the idea of the television. And here was something that was really interesting to me, is that, did you know that in the UK in particular, and I'm sure it was probably a similar time frame in the States, the telephone, right? It was actually in the 1970s where the telephone became common in every household. So in the late 60s, it was said that less than 40% of people had a telephone in their home. But by the end of the 70s, you know, almost 100%, kind of in Western nations. Mobile phone, first one, at least for kind of the earliest beginnings of kind of common public use, was in the 1980s. And I remember in the 80s, my father had a friend who thought, you know, this is in the 80s, or maybe it was, no, it was in the 80s, early 90s at the latest, but definitely in the 80s. You know, he was convinced that everybody would have one of these mobile phones one day. And my dad, he just couldn't see it. I mean, and to be fair, my dad still doesn't have a mobile phone. So some people will never change in that way. Late laggard adopter in that sense. But yeah, I mean, you think about the communication that we have now. I mean, I remember, you know, the kind of the rise of cell phones, and I was a late adopter, resisted that. But I spent, you know, as a teenager, hours and hours and hours on the phone with the long cord. The longer the cord, the better, because you could stretch it around, you know, and, you know, take it into my room, that kind of thing. And then the cordless phone, like, you know, the innovation that brought. And then, of course, now, you know, cell phones, internet, the fact that we can, you know, instantly video communicate. I don't know if you remember long distance phone calls, right? And the idea you really had to watch your time, you know, and then the bills that would result from all these long distance phone calls. Yeah, my parents calling, you know, back home to Britain. Yeah, it was a thing. Now we think nothing of it, right? It's instant video communication with, you know, especially back then, relative, you know, no cost at all. So totally amazing. Super grateful for our ability to communicate in all the ways that we do, you know, live, instantaneously, through video, you know, written word, typed, printed, absolutely incredible. And I just marvel at humans' abilities to communicate and the complexity through which we communicate, and how we're able to communicate just about anything, our thoughts, our ideas, our emotions, and how that, you know, can be preserved and, you know, broadcast. It's incredible. And I always keep in mind, you know, like, other species communicate as well. And yeah, you know, what was the quote about, you know, they're like the chimpanzee being able to learn, you know, human language. Well, what human has ever learned any little bit of chimpanzee, right? Like, we often put down other species thinking that we are, you know, more superior in our forms of communication. But, you know, what have we really truly learned about other species and their ability to communicate? I think even just scratching the surface, it brings an absolute wonder, an absolute marvel. And also, like I mentioned too, just not sure what we can do about it, but just kind of being aware of that diversity of communication and the kind of the loss of it that is happening. So anyways, those are my thoughts today, just reflecting on that whole spectrum of human communication, yeah, throughout the ages. 100 Days of Gratitude, day 79.